Hello, welcome to my basement once again. I haven't been here for a while, but I'm doing a little work from home and thought I would just go ahead and make this recording now. Um, this is going to be the last one for a while, I think, because it's been getting harder and harder to work this into my day, and I suspect that as folks are doing more and more during the week, that it's not being as needed as it was before. So I'll probably be I'll just suspend this for a while and uh, pick it up again maybe in the fall. But today we're just going to look at uh, the reading from the Gospel of Matthew again. Still in Matthew, it will that tends to be the daily lectionary uh, for this time of year in this cycle. And I hope you'll continue to check out the daily lectionaries on the PCUSA website. It's always worth checking out and doing some study on your own. So this is from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you, and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets, and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." So that's kind of a stinging indictment of the Pharisees and the scribes that Jesus is making. It's, I think, mostly a reflection of the community that the writer of Matthew is part of. I think they see themselves as sort of in an adversarial relationship with other Jewish groups around them. And so they are sort of projecting these characteristics on the the group around Jesus. Um, you know, too often we take our cues from the New Testament when it comes to how we understand who the Pharisees were and what kind of leaders and teachers and people they were. And that view from the Gospels is very slanted. Because the gospel writers understood themselves as sort of being in conflict with that group. And so they saw Jesus as being in constant conflict with that group. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus did not critique the religious leadership around him. I'm sure that he did. And I'm sure that created a lot of tension between him and them. But it's, I think, really not a fair depiction to say that, Pharisees were by sort of just, wholesale dishonest or hypocritic or whatever. In fact, the Pharisees were a devout group of Jewish leaders and students, and they followed what they believed was an oral Torah, which was passed down to them through the generations from Moses himself. So they had sort of access, they believe, to what would be considered sort of secret knowledge, but then that helped them to interpret the written Torah, and they interpreted it in a very demanding way. Uh, if it were not for the Pharisees, I suspect that Judaism might not have survived the destruction of the temple in 68 and 70, because once that was removed, then the center of Jewish religious life was eliminated. But the Pharisees had already sort of developed this practice, some of these practices of prayers around the hearth, and they had shifted the understanding of sacrifice to be an interior experience and not something physical and exterior. So, that the elements were already in place because of the Pharisees to allow Judaism to have a life separate from the temple. That's a remarkable accomplishment, because religions do die, but Judaism was able to sort of make that shift. A very close friend of mine, a rabbi here in Williamsville, the one I had a Bible study with a few months ago, Alex Lazarus Klein, says that Judaism, as we know it today, rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, sort of grew up together. And I think that's actually absolutely true, because both movements sort of developed in the shadow of the destruction of the temple, and they were vying for a while for, I think, sort of status within their society, of which one would sort of inherit the mantle of the faith. But Christianity sort of went off toward the Gentile world, and did not sort of focus only on Judea. It went out into the Roman Empire, whereas Judaism sort of made its focus in Judea, and then the practices in Judea were sort of moved out into the rest of the diaspora, so that again, pilgrimages and that kind of thing were no longer a necessity, and it became possible for Jews to practice their faith separate from Jerusalem, and that was a necessity because the Romans drove the Jews out of Judea. Essentially, they not obviously all of them, but certainly out of Jerusalem, and began to populate it with their own people. So there was a tremendous hardship that was being undergone in those years following 70 for Jews in Judea. I don't know that the Jewish experience outside of there, in the wider Roman Empire, was nearly as harsh as it was in Judea, because for the Romans it wasn't a matter of that they were Jews. That wasn't their issue. It was that they were resistant to Roman occupation, and they treated the population in Judea the way they would treat any population that put up that kind of resistance. So Jews could live peacefully in the diaspora, but not in Judea anymore. So you have, I think, in this passage sort of elements of that what would almost be considered, I think, an internal religious conflict between different types of Jews who followed Jesus and Jews who maintained the practices of Torah. And so, that clash is reflected somewhat, I think, in a passage like this one. And again, Jesus is demanding absolute fidelity, absolute allegiance from his followers, and part of that meant humility. So those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That is, exalted in the kingdom of God. Those folks, again, this reversal of status that is very common in the Gospels. Those folks who are on top now are going to be on the bottom in God's kingdom. And all of that is at work in this. And you note that he doesn't tell the crowd to not listen to them, to those leaders. Just don't emulate them. So do what they tell you to do, but don't do what they do. That's, again, it's a shot at probably an imagined set of behaviors, and not historically accurate. There is very good evidence that Pharisees and those who came after the Pharisees, the rabbis who put together the Talmud, for instance, in the Mishnah, these were devout, caring, loving, compassionate people, but who understood their lives to be lived within this, within the parameters of Torah, and interpreting Torah in a way that gave them a sense of dwelling with God in every aspect of their lives. So Torah was an all-encompassing worldview, and not strictly a sort of set of religious demands. And so all of life was to be sort of understood as in light of the practice of Torah, because that's how they understood God's presence. It's a demanding life, but not onerous. That would have been considered liberating for them. And the path that Jesus calls us to walk is also demanding, but when we walk it with a sense of commitment, it is not an onerous thing to be loving and compassionate and humble. It's a joyful thing. And so there is a similar sort of a parallel expectation with the life following Christ. Yesterday in worship we heard the passage, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So this idea that we carry these tremendous burdens all the time, I mean, we're always going to be carrying a burden, and we can either carry one that is onerous and difficult and wears us down, or we can carry, Jesus is offering a burden that is rooted in compassion and love of neighbor, that is a light burden. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. So this is the dynamic at work in Matthew's gospel. That what Jesus is offering is something that we can bear because he's offering it to bear it with us. And their characterization of the Pharisees is that they're leaving you out on your own, that they're not going to lift a finger to help you. That is probably not an accurate depiction, but it's the depiction that the writer of the gospel wanted to paint, because it's a polemic. The gospels are written to make an argument and to provide material for followers to use in their lives as they navigate their way in that society. So we always have to, I think, take whatever we hear about the Pharisees and the Gospels with a grain of salt, and realize that there are other motivations behind these depictions that are driving them. So it's important, I think, to be mindful of that, so that we don't have a distorted picture of Judaism, because Judaism is a faith that is deeply loving and compassionate, just as Christianity is. So it's important that we recognize that and not distort our image of what Judaism actually is. So that's one take on this particular reading, and I know that you all are doing lots of things now that summer is here and the warm weather has begun, and we can get out more often and things are opening up. So as I say, these little sessions I'll discontinue for now, but I look forward to picking them up again with you in September, and do continue to do the things that are needed to keep yourself and folks around you safe and healthy, and I trust you'll be well through the summer, and I hope you'll join us for worship on Sunday mornings. We are live streaming our worship service at 9:30 on Sunday mornings. You can access that on YouTube, so through this venue, or on Facebook, or through our website for the church, which then will give you a link to the Boxcast presentation each Sunday morning. And if you miss it at 9:30, you can always watch it later. It will be captured on those platforms as well. So I do hope you'll continue to be a part of our worship life at North Presbyterian Church. Friends, be well.